Hey there, Lawfare listeners. Editor-in-Chief Benjamin Wittes here with a quick favor to ask. We want to hear from you to make Lawfare as insightful and engaging as possible. Whether you read our in-depth national security law and policy analysis, listen to our podcasts, watch our live streams, whether you're an occasional reader or a true superfan, your feedback is essential to helping us improve. We've put together a short audience survey, and while we know you're busy, we'd really appreciate it if you could take just a few minutes to fill it out. You'll find it at lawfaremedia.org/survey and in the show notes of this episode. Your input helps us understand what's working, what's not working, what you want more of, what you want less of, and how we can better serve you. So when you have a moment, please visit lawfaremedia.org/survey and let us know what matters most to you. Thanks for your support. And now on to today's show.
So Nastya, how was your Super Bowl viewing watching? Was it as you predicted? Were all your favorite players in it?
Yes. It happened completely outside of my sight. I did not watch anything. I only learned about the fact that it happened because I was on a podcast the following morning and people were talking about it. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess Taylor Swift is involved. Like that's my level of understanding.
Barely this time because Travis did not have a big game, so they didn't really have a lot of reason to bring Taylor on screen.
I'll tell you, for the peace building community, Jalen Hurts' famous phraseologies are very important for us. I had a purpose before everyone had an opinion. I mean, if you want to sum up the global peace building community, that's a pretty good phraseology that we can all stand behind. So his victory is all of our victory. And the man is just the coolest human being who's ever existed. So I think on behalf of all of us, Jalen Hurts and his full female representation team, as he rocks in with his cigar, just making sure everyone realizes that he is steady Eddie. I mean, good for all of us.
He's the classic warrior philosopher mold of old.
I mean, is he really the General Mathis of the NFL?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am your host, Scott R. Anderson, thrilled to be back with you for the podcast where we invite you to join members of the Lawfare team and friends of Lawfare as we try to make sense of the week's biggest national security news stories. And I'm thrilled to be joined by possibly the most transnational team of commentators that we have ever pulled together here on Rational Security. First, we have, of course, our managing editor, Tyler McBrien, currently located in our closest southern neighbor, the country of Mexico. Tyler, thank you for joining us away from your tropical vacation. I'm sorry to have pulled you away.
Buenos dias.
You don't seem too sunburned or roasted, which is how I feel like I would be if I were in Puerto Vallarta right now. So the fact that you can still move your face is a big plus. You've got that edge on me. Well done. Well played.
I was lathering on the SPF 50.
That's the way you gotta. 50 is where I start. You don't want to know where I end. It gets brutal. It gets stuff you can only find in dark corners of the internet. So just be ready. That's what your late 30s and 40s do to you. And joining us as well from the city of Kyiv, of course, our Ukraine fellow, Nastya Lapatina. Nastya, thank you for coming on the podcast again.
Dobry večer, since we're being all international today.
Hey, we'll take it. We'll take it.
Yeah.
And joining us for the first time on Rational Security, a true international man of mystery from the most exotic city of all, Chicago, Illinois, in this particular intersection, but truly a man of the world, none other than the managing director of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace, Mr. Joel Braunold. Joel, thank you for joining us on Rational Security this week.
I feel like I'm on the Around the Horn of foreign policy podcasts. I'm extremely excited to be with you, Scott, Anastasia, and Tyler, so thank you for having me.
I think you can truly say, we founded the format of 3 topics, 20 minutes each, and then a random lesson at the end, right? Nobody beat us to that, I think. We're thrilled. We're happy to have you here on the OG of that particular podcast format. Because we have 3 big topics coming up out of the news this week. There are no small national security news stories these days, but we have a couple that are particularly up the alleys of our guests and worth talking about with you all. Topic 1 for this week, Gaza Es Su Gaza. President Donald Trump shocked the world last week when, at a joint press briefing with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he announced plans for the United States to own Gaza, take responsibility for reconstructing it, and ultimately renovate it into a Riviera on the Eastern Mediterranean. one he later made it clear that Palestinians would no longer be allowed to live in. What of this plan is serious and what is bluster, and what impact will it have on the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including the delicate ceasefire that Trump's team worked so hard to secure just weeks ago in Gaza? Topic 2. Bullets for bauxite. President Trump recently reiterated his desire for a quick end to the conflict in Ukraine, a topic on which senior Trump administration and Ukrainian officials will be talking soon. But peace may come at a price, in this case a deal guaranteeing U.S. access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, among other concessions. Is Trump's timeline realistic, and how is his administration's America First tack likely to impact the trajectory of the conflict? And for the record, before anybody ats me on Blue Sky or other social media, I know bauxite is not a rare earth mineral, but it starts with the letter B, and it came to my brain. So forgive me on that one. Topic 3. Quid pro quo. Acting Deputy Attorney General Emile Bove took the exceptional step yesterday of directing the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York to dismiss corruption charges arising from alleged improper contributions and other relationships with foreign government officials against New York Mayor Eric Adams, so that Adams could focus his energy on combating high crime and unlawful immigration. What should we make of this extraordinary step by the Trump administration, and what does it mean for the broader relationship with the Justice Department? For our first topic, I want to start with you, Joel, because you follow these developments closer than just about anyone. And I think it's safe to say that the last week has been incredibly chaotic and hard to understand for a lot of folks who follow the Israeli-Palestinian kind of peace process and issue set writ large, of which I am one. Even by the very high bar of chaos that usually surrounds that issue set, particularly the last few years, because this declaration by President Trump, something that I think it's safe to say was not expected, came very unexpectedly, even though there are little hints of it kind of littered throughout the prior Trump administration, littered through prior Trump statements by people like Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who was closely involved with Middle East policy during the first Trump administration. It still came kind of out of nowhere. And it's something we've seen his administration actively walk back in various regards, essentially asserting, no, we're going to own Gaza, but it's not going to involve any U.S. troops on the ground. Waffling a little bit at times about whether Palestinians will or won't be allowed to continue to live there, although in his most recent comments, President Trump pretty clearly seemed to signal he expected Palestinians to be resettled in places like Jordan and Egypt. And exactly what this plan is and how it fits into the broader picture, and particularly the regional relationships that had been up until now such a focus of the Trump administration, or really everyone working on this issue, trying to find some way to leverage the relationship with the Saudis in particular and the other Gulf states, and normalization with Israel being a big point of leverage over the conflict as a whole, that now seems jeopardized, or at least complicated substantially by this proposal that is very controversial with, I think, Arab governments. Talk to me a little bit about where this comes from, how surprised you were by this, and where it fits into this kind of broader picture.
So you can read this multiple different ways, depending on if you think this is a master negotiation strategy or something else. So I think to give it a full understanding, let's look at it from two different perspectives. If you look at it from the perspective of those who say, look, this is shaking everything up and creating an outside of the box idea in order to shake up the region to offer suggestions. That's one interpretation that I think when you listen to the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, when you listen to Secretary of State Rubio, when you listen to the White House press secretary, this is sort of the indication that they're making. That President Trump shocked everyone, including me and everyone else, when in his joint press conference, he started his pitch with the US will not rule out sending troops. And we will, as a gift to everyone, take over Gaza. We will clear out the rubble, we'll rebuild it, and it will be the Riviera of the Middle East that we'll own. And so, quickly, there were walkbacks, there was this, there was that, and it seems like the walkbacks that were really implicit, were that there won't be US troops and there won't be US funding spent. But when you take out the threat of US troops and you take out the potential for US funding, then the real question is this a bluff at all? Because if the Saudis and the Gulf, who instantaneously at 4 a.m. rejected this, if you want to call their bluff, then, what you're bluffing needs to be substantial, that you stand behind it. And I think that they're aware that there is no real support for an AUMF for US troops to go to Gaza, or even, one would argue, private military contractors to clean it out. And probably there isn't a desire to spend upwards of $50 billion in Gaza, in some way. So, therefore, people started around the Trump administration to say, look, this is just him shaking it up, and it's forcing the region to fundamentally come back to the US with a better suggestion. That if you don't have a suggestion, give us a better one. And as you heard sort of the day before Trump's press conference and the days following, Steve Witkoff, who, as we mentioned, is Trump's Middle East envoy, had managed to get the ceasefire deal. You know, it started leaking out that this is not such a good deal, and especially in the later stages. You know, he flew over Gaza in a helicopter and said, you know, the whole place is a demolition site. People can't live there safely. So we need to think about something else. And so some people think, look, this is just Trump taking out the third stage of the ceasefire, which is supposed to be about reconstruction, and opening it up into a serious topic. And that realistically, this is about trying to pressure Hamas to give up ownership in their territory, as well as potentially forcing some Gazans to at least relocate temporarily and then maybe come back in later. And you can read into it sort of what you want, but the aim is that this is to put pressure on Hamas to realize that they need to take an exile, that not only can they not govern Gaza, but they need to be exiled. And if you want to look at it through that lens, okay, if that's the perspective you want to look at it through, well, today, the Secretary General of the Arab League, no small important figure within the region, said, you know, if it's not in the Palestinian interest for Hamas to be in charge, they need to leave. They need to give up governance. So you could say, look, there's already been shifts, and that what President Trump has done is that he's changed the dynamics of the deal away from, well, Hamas are just there and we haven't managed to defeat them, so we'll just find some way to, you know, there'll be a titular head of a new committee, but they'll still be there. He's saying, no, that's not going to happen. And that, of course, really plays with the Israeli audience. But that's sort of one reading that I think many in the region, as well as I would say Palestinians, probably Hamas and Fatah, are probably all saying, like, he's not serious about actually evacuating 1.8 million Gazans, you know, good luck if you want to try. And that, you know, with the Arab League support, the Egyptians already rejecting King Abdullah of Jordan's in the White House today, like, and with the Saudi real solidly against this and their largesse, you know, this is probably just an opening gambit that can be pushed aside. And it's really about shaking everyone up to give their own perspectives. That's one read. The flip side read is, no, he's very serious. Okay. And, you know, yes, he won't use US troops and he'll find some other way for people to own it. But every time he's asked, he doubles down. He doubles down on the aircraft. He doubles down, and he seems pretty serious about this and said he's thought it out. And the most important thing for me is that even if you want to say it's a bluff, there is one group in the world that has taken this at face value. And that is the society and the government of the State of Israel. The Israeli cabinet just met and said just a few minutes ago that they fully endorsed Trump's vision for Gaza. The prime minister in the Knesset yesterday said, you wanted a vision of the day after. I agree with President Trump's vision. I brought it back from DC. It has no PA and no Hamas, and that's my vision. And it has changed the polity and the policy options in Israel that has enabled to give the Israelis a magic button. It is a button that they can press, that they don't have to do anything, and that collectively that they can just press the button, and in the most powerful man in the world, in a way that he says humane, in a way that will be voluntary, that the Gaza problem just disappears. And they don't have to think about it anymore. And once you offer someone a magic button that, as President Trump said, is voluntary and humane and everything else, and they don't have to ever compromise a dream, they're going to go for the dream. And you've seen across the Israeli political spectrum sort of welcoming of this option. And even if it's not real, how you unspool that is almost impossible. And the last thing I'll say, and I know I've gone on, but it has been a complicated week, is, you know, people say this is a new idea. I mean, the concept of transfer is not new in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In many ways, it's the original idea, right? You know, whether it's, as the Palestinians say, the Nakba, or sort of ideas that are floated in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And look, there's always been an option of transfer, but it's been pushed to the side as politically unacceptable. And President Trump's floating of this idea and adoption of it has made it acceptable, not just in terms of re-energizing sort of a Smotrich Ben-Gvir on the far right of the spectrum, but changing the centrist part of the spectrum as well. Also in diaspora communities, much to the horror and chagrin of many others and of the region. So whether this was a bluff or not, it has had a very big impact. And we haven't got into the details of the ceasefire that are also being sort of messed around, but that's sort of the opening salvo.
Yeah, I just want to put an even finer point on the transfer point that Joel is making. I was recently reading some old Benny Morris work, and he's a noteworthy Israeli historian, and he actually in the late 2000s, he characterized David Ben-Gurion as a transferist. I don't think he was using this in a critical way, but as Joel was saying, this is an idea that, since the founding.
But is it safe to say, Joel, I mean, it seems to me that among all the different interpretations of what this could be, and in a very typical Trump way, we're all, have this as a Rorschach test where we're taking the corners of this shape and projecting a lot of sense of what parts he's serious about, what parts he isn't, and seeing what we see out of it. And we all have priors that, inform what we hope to see out of it, or maybe not. The part that seems to be the sticking point is the Palestinian permanent relocation possibility. That seems to be the point that if you take that out of the equation, that's part that was just reiterated by Trump in the last 48 hours. That there's a lot more ambiguity about in some of the early statements, but seemed to be pinned down in a press meeting just a couple of days ago in the White House. If you take that out, it seems like a lot of the regional governments would have less of a clear concern. They may have a concern with even temporary relocation, but that's because people worry about the credibility of any assurances you can give that people will be allowed to come back. But if somehow you could get to credible assurance that they could, I'm not even sure temporary relocation would be a red line. Again, I don't know if that might be a fictional credibility that you could actually get there. But it's this idea of permanent relocation. How wedded to that is the Israeli buy-in into this idea? And does it seem to be in the Trump conception? Because that strikes me as a line that's going to be hard to get even regional governments over. And it's hard to know where exactly it fits, how centrally it fits into this for Trump. But for the Israelis, it actually seems to be a big part of the equation to some extent.
I mean, Scott, the reason that President Sisi and Prime Minister Netanyahu haven't managed to have a conversation since October 7th is that the Prime Minister has not denied President Sisi's worry that the aim is to permanently push the Gazans into Egypt. And that, early on when Secretary Blinken, just after October 7th, did a rotation around the region to see if countries would take them, he heard no. And the Israelis, and it's come up again, you've heard it a lot, why will no country in the region take them? This is so cruel and everything else. And part of it is there's no guarantee they can return. And the main aspect of Palestinian identity is solidly around the concept of samudness, steadfastness, and they're not going to leave the land, and the ongoing catastrophe that was the creation of the state of Israel. And so you're dealing with people's sacred values here. So if you could find a way to guarantee that they could come back, and there was a pledge that would backed up by a law in the Knesset and maybe a UN Security Council resolution and all the things that you would need, could you temporarily relocate people? Maybe. How many Gazans would leave if being given options to go to like a Western country? I don't know, let's assume that 500,000. I'm throwing numbers out. This is not based on anything, but let's assume 500,000. Okay, those people are probably the most upwardly socially mobile of Gazan society. So what you'd have left is you would remove the middle and upper class, and then you just have people who are left, and how you rebuild a society there is also complicated in terms of what that would look like. And so if people don't want to leave, what happens? You cut off all humanitarian aid and say, well, you can stay and it's voluntary, but you'll starve? Or do you say, if you stay, we're going to assume that you support Hamas and therefore you're a legitimate target? So these are all questions, but to answer your question about the permanency of it all, the Prime Minister hasn't endorsed it. He said it's very interesting, but what President Trump did is that he defined what total victory looks like in a way that the Prime Minister has never been able to do. Prime Minister Netanyahu never defined what total victory was. There was sort of, Hamas doesn't have a governing capability and they'll never threaten us again. President Trump comes in, offers this vision. Prime Minister Netanyahu is like, that's the vision I agree with. That's total victory. Now, how you can get there, can you get there? How do you make it step back? There's lots of questions, but just quickly on the ceasefire, because it's another part of what's going on. So Hamas has these macabre demonstrations every time they release hostages, where each week they release them and there's like a whole show put on where they're given certificates. And in a previous one, they made a hostage, declare that they're looking forward to seeing their wife and kids who had been murdered by Hamas on October 7th. And it increasingly drives the global, a lot of people mad, but especially the Israeli population nuts as this goes on. And the last one, the 3 male hostages were incredibly emaciated, and analogies were made to Holocaust victims in terms of when they were released. And each time it happens, the frustration and anger in Israel at Hamas goes up. They see that Hamas is clearly in control, that at least those masked individuals don't seem to be emaciated themselves. It challenges the stories that they've been told that Gazans are starving, and they see that their hostages were starving. They hear stories about when these people came back about how they were mistreated. By the way, there are, on the Palestinian media dynamic, when their prisoners are being released, some of which were in administrative detention, some of which are serving life sentences, they go in their media and have stories of abuse and other things. So they're like, no one's paying attention to ours. Can you make ethical comparisons? No. And there's like a whole, as everything in Israel-Palestine, you can't compare and all the other parts. But what is this to say? President Trump is also watching and has become frustrated and basically said, Hamas better watch out. If they continue to do this, I'm going to put the hammer down. And then yesterday morning, so on the 10th, Hamas said we're suspending the prisoner transfers, the hostage releases, because they say that Israel's broken the ceasefire agreement on the humanitarian access and others. But by doing that, they opened, President Trump said, fine, if you don't release all the hostages, not just the ones in the first phase, but all 72 remaining hostages by Saturday at 12, Israel should rain hellfire down on you, right? Basically all hell will break loose. And the Israelis tried to figure out what their position would be. And today they just came out, Prime Minister Netanyahu, as we are recording this podcast, just came out and said, if Hamas doesn't release the 9 remaining live hostages, so not all, but the 9 that are part of phase 1, by Saturday at 12, the ceasefire's off. You broke it, as in Hamas broke it, and this is now the new renegotiation. And so now the question is, how do they renegotiate? But again, President Trump said all hostages. The Israeli cabinet said 9. So Bibi's now being attacked by his far right, by Ben Gvir, saying it should be all, not just 9. And why are you playing around with this? And so again, President Trump in multiple different fashions is taking a position far to the right of at least where the cabinet is on various different issues, moving it that way, maybe for a negotiation tactic. But by doing so, he schleps the entire Israeli polity to that space as well and pushes them up a tree. For how they can come down from that tree, if they want to come down from that tree, and how you can therefore get the rest of the region in, has huge effects on Saudi normalization, on Abraham Accords, on the future of Gaza, on what might happen in the West Bank. And I'll finish off by saying this. President Trump loves deadlines, and he's created a triple lock deadline on March 1st. Deadline number 1. It's the beginning of Ramadan. Okay. Often a very difficult period of stability in other parts when it comes to Israel-Palestine. Deadline number 2. He said in his press conference with Bibi that he will make a decision on annexation, whether he'll give a green light to annex the West Bank in 4 weeks, which again corresponds with the beginning of March. Deadline number 3, if the ceasefire deal technically holds, phase 2 begins on March 1st. Oh, and by the way, by the end of March, Israel has to pass a budget or the coalition collapses. So, deadlines make actions. We are in for a truly insane period of time when it comes to Israel-Palestine for the next few weeks. And that is why you feel confused, and I think lots of people do as well.
Oh, great. I thought that we were already in an insane period, but Scott, I'm curious your take on the international legal angle. We've been using words like transfer, relocation, but there are other words that others are using, like ethnic cleansing, denial of the right of return of Palestinians. I'm curious your read on what Trump is calling for from the international legal point of view, and increasingly what the Israeli polity is endorsing as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to square any of this with any conventional understanding of international law. There are unconventional understandings that, a lot of Israelis and certain supporters of Israel have kind of put forward that have some grasp, but have never really taken off with most people who look at this stuff. And a lot of them apply more readily in the West Bank than in Gaza, potentially. But what exactly would be the basis of an Israeli claim over Gaza as a territory is really a little bit unclear, right? Like they could have their same combination of it being kind of terra nullius, like basically never really having been a state and therefore not something they're violating traditional international law principle of by claiming territory over, which is what an argument they made about the West Bank. That would have been an easier argument to make about Gaza as well, potentially up until the withdrawal. But of course, Israel kind of disavowed any interest or claims in Gaza after the withdrawal, at least to some extent, at least in some statements. So what do you end up doing here? I think it probably ends up looking like the argument ends up looking a little bit more like the Golan Heights, where you saw this argument that, yes, this was Syrian territory, but Syria was an aggressor against us. We took it as necessary for security property. If we're acting in defensive, we're not engaging in offensive international war. We inherited this territory, and over time, we develop enough ties. There's some vague self-determination threads that get tied in there with the kind of the Druze population of the Golan Heights, and that we're going to extend to that. And now there's this new question about this new slice of Syria Israel has been occupying, where they also have Druze communities that genuinely have close ties both to Druze and communities in the Golan Heights and with the Israelis who've been providing them support and a security umbrella throughout a lot of the Syrian civil war, how that argument might be extended there where you don't have this like long period of occupation and slow integration like you did with the Golan. I think that might be more of an argument you see. That none of these are arguments that the international community is going to buy into really very credibly at all. The United States is one state that seems like will, certainly the Trump administration might. How you square that, I don't know. I mean, we saw the Trump administration, the last administration, revoke a 1977 Herb Ansel letter, which had long established the position that, settlements in the West Bank are presumptively illegal under international law. Reagan administration had kind of like toned down that opinion, but never rescinded it. And other than that, it had been the U.S. position up to that point. They replaced it with an opinion written by Jennifer Newstead, who was the legal advisor at the time, and State Department people, but never released it, never really gave away much details on it. We heard the Biden administration kind of do a soft revocation of that position or reversal, where they started saying in press statements in their last year in office, no, settlements in the West Bank are presumptively unlawful under international law, but they haven't reinstated the Hansel letter. We don't know what the legal basis of it is. So long story short, we don't know what the outer parameters of what is reasonable in the Middle East context is from the U.S. policy perspective. And frankly, what the first Trump administration thought, what the State Department lawyers might think, may not matter that much in the end, because Donald Trump may have his views and they will come up with some argument as to why it's lawful under international law, or maybe not even bother. And that might be enough. The problem with that is that it causes problems with the rest of the international community. Like, you've got to have some basis for arguing about why this is okay and legitimate that meets some sort of standard. Particularly if you're kicking the Palestinians out, that's where it gets really hard. That's like the clearer sort of thing you're clearly not allowed to do very expressly under international humanitarian law or international human rights law. Again, if you pull out that plank, then you can see ways you can reconcile a lot of this other stuff potentially in different formats. But it's that permanent relocation that is going to be the hugest sticking point for a lot of the international community. And then what comes after that as well, which has always been the secret of this conflict that people miss. The reason why Israelis came around the two-state solution eventually for a long time is because it was the one way to reconcile the treatment of Palestinians with international law and standards and general morals, which is that, yes, they're second-class citizens, but it's because they are on a path to citizenship in their own state. And as long as we're on this trajectory, it's all temporary state, and we can deal with these temporary exceptions from conventional international law and human rights standards. If you have annexation, if you have of Gaza or the West Bank, and all of a sudden you have these populations that live there, but they don't have a full flight of political rights, and the reason they don't appears to be primarily some mixture of, cultural, religious, historical. Palestinian kind of overlaps all three of those. That's hard to square with how anybody thinks about anything these days. And you'll hear a lot of whataboutism about lots of other states that don't have liberal rights, lots of states in the Middle East, et cetera. And those are all fair and true. But Israel, if you start saying, well, Israel's more like those countries than European countries and other countries that buy into more robust concepts of democracy, that puts Israel in a very different camp and a very different universe of states with which the United States traditionally has relationships. I think that's actually going to be a more bitter pill to swallow for a lot of Americans, and especially for a lot of Europeans and other citizens around the world, than people are really reconciling with now, whether in Israel or anywhere else.
If you thought, that wasn't crazy enough, yesterday, the Palestinian Authority officially ended their policy of pay to slay, which has been a US demand since the first Trump administration. It's been met with cautious optimism, even by massive critics of the PA, though not by the State of Israel that says it's all a con. You've got the Prisoners Club in Ramallah criticizing Abbas for doing it, demonstrating that it's definitely something, not just a renaming. And the Saudis are just livid from their public statements at everything. And it's just never-ending churning of different pieces of news, of pretty seismic things that could be transformative, but each one is being subsumed into a news cycle that just doesn't stop. And it's not a news cycle that's, a little bit here, a little bit there. These are like massive body blows into people's ideas, understandings about what could and couldn't be possible. And some people just tune it out and are just saying, let's get the hostages back and let's end the conflict in Gaza. Others are like, no, now's the opportunity to go for broke. Others are like, let's reset. There was one report that said that the Palestinian Authority is willing to use the Trump deal of the century as an opening negotiation point when it comes to the Trump administration. I mean, you talk about seismic shifts. These are seismic shifts for people who work in these spaces. And how that all comes down. So all I'd say is, as we sort of come to the end of this first 20 minutes, is President Trump, as he often is definitely redefining a lot of terms. How much will last and how much will not is unclear. But I would argue, unlike other spaces where he's, threatening and then steps back and says, his statements have huge implications given how the parties actually here adopt and change their positions because of them. And that is different from trade tariff wars and what you switch on and off. You can't put the ethnic demon back in the bottle. It's out, right? And that, if I have to say what's the most impactful thing that's happened over the past 2 weeks on this, it's that. It's that the policy conversation in Israel has radically transformed.
Well, and I think that's actually a great point to zoom in on as we begin to transition to our second topic about Ukraine as well. Because I want to hear both about how Ukrainians think about this and Trump's genuine approach to this and other conflicts and how it reads back in there. But it lends back to this idea, like the justification we hear so much about Trump's freewheeling foreign policy is the disruption narrative. It's true of his domestic policy too, right? Like Trump as disruptor. And it's something we've seen really the Republican Party, particularly that wing of it affiliated with him, really take up as a pro, which is that you throw things out there, it's disrupting. He's knocking over a status quo that nobody likes. That is true to some extent. It's also an incredibly low bar for approving any sort of statement, right? Like anything can be disruptive if it's just unexpected and a little off, and doesn't align with expectations. Doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's just disruptive. And to buy into that being a universal solvent, you have to buy into a status quo that is so irrevocably damaged and detrimental that wrecking anything and leaving no part of it standing is appropriate. And then you get in the situation where somebody is actually habitually disruptive and inconsistent in their demands and their terms and how they approach a conflict. You never actually settle into a new status quo. You don't settle into something that you can actually build on. And I find that to be really difficult. And I worry that is going to be a persistent theme in a lot of these discussions, particularly in very sensitive negotiation situations like the Middle East, where the words do matter so much. In other situations, Trump can say a lot, but people focus on what the actual legal measures are. That's not the case in a lot of international negotiations. You don't get to the legal measures until you get to the words. And the words matter a lot when they're coming from the president. Nastya, let me turn to you on that. Like, this is a weird moment for Ukraine, obviously.
Very much so.
Yeah. I mean, not something we didn't foresee coming, obviously. Like, we knew Trump was coming for a number of months now. We know he has weird, different priors on Ukraine, although I don't think we 100% knew what they were coming in, because you had a lot of plans and lip service by people in Trump's orbit about how to handle the Ukraine conflict, but little from the man himself, right? Which is tricky. So how are Ukrainians viewing the way Trump has approached, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's a bunch of these other national situations, and the lessons about that for how it is approaching these scenarios? Because I've actually been interested by Zelensky's sort of strategy and approach so far, but I'd be curious about your sense of it from there on the ground.
So for several months before Trump got elected, it was kind of on the top of every Ukrainian mind. Civilians, the civil society, the government, like, what's going to happen, who's going to win, and then if Trump wins, what is that going to mean for us? And the ultimate question was, how do we make sure that he's on our side? Because that wasn't at all immediately clear that would happen. Because, I mean, the man has said a whole array of negative things, to say the least, about Ukraine, and a whole array of positive things about Putin and Russia. So it was a very scary time and a very anxious time. And the Ukrainian government approach was to understand that Trump is a transactional man. He is a president who's going to come, wreak havoc, try to change everything radically. And so we saw in that an opportunity, because as I've written about for Lawfare and as I've talked a lot about on our podcast, the Ukrainians just really hated Biden, which may sound crazy to an American audience, right? Because there's a lot of billions of dollars that you guys sent us, but Ukrainians have a negative view of the status quo. And so, you know, this anti-incumbent wave touched this Ukraine-US dynamic as well in that sense. We really wanted Biden out. And so the government thought that they can persuade Trump that supporting Ukraine is in his interest, be it because, you know, just abandoning Ukraine is going to look bad. And we've seen some reporting to indicate that indeed that's a worry, right? Like they don't want a second Afghanistan or, you know, any other kind of reference. Like he doesn't want to be like Obama in 2014, who just didn't do anything and Russians just waltzed in. So, you know, there's a lot to be said about, you know, Trump needing to look strong so he can just walk away, because that certainly wouldn't make him look strong. And so another part of that was that we were looking to offer some sort of economic interest, because again, he is a man of transactions and like hard economic interest. He just he wants to see what's in there for him. And so in fall, I think it was October, President Zelensky presented his so-called victory plan. And there were several points in there. And one of them was this point about the joint use and investment of Ukraine's critical minerals and critical resources, rare earths, minerals, whatever. At the time, that was before the American election. Pretty much everyone understood that to be a Trump sweetener. Like, it was obviously put in there for the Trump team and for the Republicans. And so what we're seeing now, this Trump's interest in Ukraine's critical minerals and critical resources. So it's not a crazy idea. And if anything, it's almost good news that, he's biting into it. Like, he's kind of reacting to what Ukraine has been offering and what Ukraine has been talking about. So I guess that's good. And we've all kind of known that he's like that he doesn't actually care about Ukraine or the right and wrong side of history or any of that. But at the same time, it still doesn't make it easier when you hear him say things like, Ukraine can be Russian, Ukraine may be Russian, Ukraine may not be Russian, like the Kremlin may be in control in Ukraine or not. Well, all I care about is that we're gonna get access to their critical minerals and we're gonna get the money, and I want a $500 billion deal, and it doesn't really matter who's in control of that territory, which is something he said just yesterday, I think, in an interview with Fox. And so certainly that's like not nice to hear as a Ukrainian, and I've definitely seen people reacting to that like, I mean, we've known that he's like that, but just like hear him say that he doesn't care if we just lose and we're killed and tortured and raped, as long as he got his lithium, like, it's sort of absurd. So it's like this kind of double-edged sword that, like, it's good that the Ukrainian government approach seems to be working, like they've poked something that's working, but at the other side is like, maybe we missed the days when this whole thing was about democracy and values and and the rest of it. So it's kind of a mixed bag. But it's actually not only the critical minerals that Ukraine is offering. Another part of it that's quite interesting, it's not something that Trump has talked about yet, but it's something that Zelensky has talked about, is that Ukraine has a lot of underground gas storage. I think we actually have the largest amount of storage in Europe, and that would be great for the US because the US, as of last year, is now the top exporter of liquefied natural gas, of LNG. This is like for the first time in the history of the industry, as far as I understand, that, the US is the top exporter of LNG. And that happened because Europe started, weaving itself off of Russian gas, after the full-scale invasion. And so Ukraine is trying to also present itself as like this potential transit hub country that, Americans come, will store your gas for you, and you can trade with the EU and make a bunch of money doing it, and it can all be great. So there is that component as well. But that's pretty much on Trump's crazy critical minerals offer.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a few threads. I think it's really interesting what you said about Ukrainians being quite critical of Biden, because again, I keep seeing similarities in another way to the Israel topic as well. I had the impression that most of Israeli society and the polity were quite excited about Trump's reelection or Trump's election. But from the point of view of maybe someone on the left in the United States who's quite critical of Biden's policy, they would be shocked at that. I think it's interesting painting Trump as this disruptor, but this, as Scott, as you were pointing out, it's not a strategy or a doctrine. It's like an anti-strategy. He's really hard to predict. I'm going to quote this morning in CNN. So this was, we're recording on February 11th. The headline is that Trump said that Ukraine may be Russian someday, which sounds damning, sounds awful. But if you read the full quote, it's still very bad. But if you read the full quote, it's a nothing statement. This is the full quote. Trump said, Ukraine may make a deal. They may not make a deal. They may be Russian someday, or they may not be Russian someday. So I like feel for Zelensky or something, because I don't know, what do you do with that? It's nothing,
It's one of those quotes that in a movie really depends on how the actor delivers it. Cause it could either be saying like, this guy is blue sometimes, or it could be like, maybe your store will get robbed. Maybe your store won't get robbed. It's all about, the inflection and the context that you put in it and statements like that. I tend to lean towards the latter interpretation, but others might not.
And just to contrast it with Biden and Israel, Biden is someone who strikes me as a true believer in Zion, in the promise of Zionism. He met with Golda Meir as a young senator. He's a true believer. He's a friend of Israel. And yet Israelis would much prefer Trump. It's just an interesting, dynamic.
Look, the bastardization of Biden's record on Israel in Israel today, people are saying had it not be for Biden's restraint of us, we would have done X, Y, and Z. Like
same here, guys. Literally to the T.
It's like we're living in it's always easy to blame someone else, right? Like the aircraft carriers also helped. And you have this bizarre dynamic in Israel where the level of dependence on America is, the whole thing is that Israel's strong by itself, with itself. We're not asking you to spend, your blood and treasure, even though we get military assistance, we portray and push American values and all the other different pieces that's part of the US-Israel bilateral relationship. But it's Israel makes its own decisions. And yet, the dependency on the US in order to continue fighting the war was very high, which led to people saying, why didn't the US use more leverage? The reason being that the leverage is limited because if it becomes existential, they'll just say no. And then where are you actually going to push the leverage onto? And then with Trump, the irony was he started off by pushing them into an unpopular ceasefire. You had massive critiques coming out of Israel saying, Steve Witkoff's been hoodwinked by the Qataris and, the Israelis are on a death match with the Qataris right now, punish the Qataris, hit them hard. You don't hear that coming from Trump. What they love about Trump is that he gave them lots of things before and he doesn't care about international law. And when you look at, as Scott said, the opponents who are on the ascendancy of any negotiation with the Palestinians also hate international law. And so the whole construct of might makes right. Israel right now is a very strong, mighty nation that is restrained by international norms. How much are they restrained? You can argue. So if you've got a president who's like, you do what the hell you want. By the way, don't bomb Iran though. Right? So, okay, they're willing to sacrifice some of these bigger things because they feel that Trump's such a strong force that he'll prevent Iran rearming other people, that they can give up on something they wouldn't have if you believed in a system of international laws that they feel, and like the international world order, that they feel fundamentally undercuts them and their strategic needs. They want to have a freedom of operation over all of their allies. What I find the most interesting though, Tyler, and I'd love to hear, Anesthesia, your concept of this when it comes to the Ukraine. When it came to Biden, the only voice really in the Mideast that he was really listening to was the Israelis. What the Syrians or Lebanese wanted, it was really irrelevant. Even if it was relevant, the actual hard power dynamics weren't. The Americans built a missile shield for Israel with its allies against the Iranians as they went backwards and forwards. When it comes to Trump, Israel is competing with the Qataris, now Lebanon, now Syria, now Turkey, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And it's actually limited their freedom of operations regionally, but it's empowered them locally to have this total victory with the Palestinians. And for the Israeli average person, they're like, okay, I'll take that trade. But for Israeli strategic decision makers, the difficulty of dealing with Washington was best summed up by a prominent member of FDD that said with Trump, you go into the casino and you could win the lottery or you could lose your house. And you just roll the dice each time. So everything's very high stakes, but you could win your house. You could win your lottery. But at the exact same time, you shake the dice the other way and it could go the other way. And it's a very hard way to deal with existential decisions. And I'll just say, this whole thing that Israel makes decisions by itself, on itself, and doesn't listen to. The cabinet decision today was hiding behind Trump. It was like, we'll do what Donald said. It's like, cool, but if you have decisions that you want to make, they're your interest, they're your citizens, you should make that decision. It shouldn't just be like, well, we like what the president said. And that disconnect is going to be really acute, especially that Donald Trump's term limited. These things aren't going to disappear in 4 years. You could take hatches to them, but ultimately you're going to have to deal with Democrats and the rest of the world and everything else that falls flat. And so that's a real complicated dynamic that I think we're all still sorting through.
He's term limited for now.
Sure.
That's a great addition, Tyler. I I know you shouldn't compare these things because there are so many differences and so much historical baggage and things like that. But if we were to compare, which is certainly something that Ukrainians do all the time, if we were to compare these two dynamics, it's very interesting because both Israel and Ukraine are, I mean, kind of inherently dependent on the US and the US military and other aid. Both Israel and Ukraine are facing a war, a conflict, an existential threat. And the relationship is so different in a way that Ukrainians just don't understand. And I mean, a part of it is just Ukrainians, being victims of a brutal genocidal invasion and being emotional about it. But even on the level of like political scientists and journalists and people who should understand this, a lot of people really don't get why, if Iran sends a bunch of missiles at Israel, American planes and American air defense is shooting that down. But when the same thing or worse, it is actually worse in terms of the consequences. When that happens to Ukraine, I mean, the US is nowhere near that because Russia nukes, etc. And so this dynamic, this fact that Israel can do, and this is just my opinion, whatever they want, like they can kill as many people they want, they can break as many laws as they want, like they can have a terrible reputation in half of the planet, and the US is still going to be a loyal ally and have a special relationship. And Ukrainians, follow the international law to the T, specifically so the ally support is there, right? Like our POWs get beheaded regularly, and we still keep them in stellar conditions when it comes to like the Russians that we take, the Russian soldiers that we have in prisons. We don't use a bunch of weapons that we could have. Like we're so worried about this international standard and laws that we have to keep because we're a part of the West and we need to keep the allied support. And still we like don't get it to the same amount that Israel does. And it's so frustrating. And then when you hear Trump be like, oh, I'm going to support you only if you give us all of your critical minerals and critical weapons. Someone tweeted like, Israel doesn't do shit and doesn't give shit and gets everything. And we have to like give all of our resources.
He's taking Gaza's resources, right? So he's like, I'll just take that as the Riviera.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. But you know what I mean, though.
No, I understand it. I think that I think there are two. It's a fascinating observation, but I'd say there are two really remarkable differences. Like, number one, Israel's facing a 7-front war from Iranian proxies. And their freedom of action against Iran is incredibly restricted, not just by Biden in the same way that the Ukrainians were, but also by President Trump. He said, you're not allowed to strike. The Israelis would love to go to war with Tehran. I mean, they don't want to, but like, let's decapitate this. In many ways, what the international community wanted Israel to do in Gaza is what they achieved in Lebanon, which is to have the maximum impact with the least amount of collateral damage through the pager operation and all the other things that they did. And they basically decapitated the Iranian best proxy in the region, and also has multiple different effects. I mean, I think the Ukrainian problem is that you're up against a nuclear superpower, or a regional power, depending on how you see Russia today. And the Israelis are against a pre-nuclear Iran that doesn't want to risk its own territory. If Israel and Iran get into a shooting war, I think that you see a far bigger restraint. The Israelis have been begging the Americans to bomb Iran, since 2006. And it hasn't happened. Even with the Soleimani stuff, there's negotiations. President Trump wants to have a negotiation with Iran. So the Israeli decision-making is that Hamas is just an arm of the Iranians. The problem is that the separate conversation, which the majority of the world, that's the Israeli argument. The majority of the world say, look, this is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and in that case, Israel being Palestine small, and therefore we'll side with the Palestinians versus the Israelis. The Israelis, they'll actually see it very analogously. Like, we're not given freedom of action when it comes to the real threat, and instead, we have to wade through impossible, legal and ethical waters to deal with Iranian proxies who dig in 400, kilometers of tunnels and don't care. They want Gazans to die because that's the strategy. The strategy is specifically that because there's no conventional win that exists. So in many ways, if they were given the freedom of action just to say, if you don't do this, we'll nuke Tehran, right? We've got, the undeclared nuclear weapons that Israel has. Like they've got a ton of weapons they haven't been able to use, and they're similarly restrained. But it's a fascinating that's the way that Ukrainians see it, because it once again belies the complete chasm that exists between how Israel sees what it is doing and it is fighting versus how literally everyone else in the world, maybe with the exception of Republican America, sees how it's going, which is this is really about Israel-Palestinians, and yeah, the Iranians and the Yemenites and the Houthis and whatever, they're all getting involved. But it's really, if there was just a two-state solution, it would figure itself out. And the Israelis are like, you're all nuts. Like, this is very clearly an existential thing. And so I think there is actually a lot more in common there.
It's just very similar, this disconnect that like Ukrainians feel like nobody else understands how existential this is for us. And same with Israel. And then there's also this mismatch between the state of Israel and the Ukrainian government. Like there's a whole conflict there as well.
Who's arming who? Do we throw the Iranians in because it's useful because of the Bet Qatar bones? Your guys' relationship with the Turks. And like separate to all this is the Palestinians, who the whole Palestinian element and pro-Palestinian protest movement had a huge impact, or a small impact, depending on who you want to argue, on the presidential election. Whereas I would argue that the Ukrainian community did not, in critical swing battleground states, did not have a similar political heightened attention that the Arab American community and the progressive youth community had.
A bunch of them voted for Trump because they're white and conservative. I know those are my people I'm talking about, but that's true.
But I think that's part of the game, right? Like, as diasporatic politics come into this, and, when you go to presidential electoral colleges, there's been countless barrels of ink spilt about, did the Gaza conflict affect, did it not? The triumphalism after Trump's statements, this is what you voted for, and, Kamala people saying that. Whereas I would argue that I maybe 3 times during the presidential election saw, how are Eastern European, migrants going to vote? But it was never really a story. Whereas it was a constant story about how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict's affecting. I think that's also a question of what's going on. Who cares about what? And to what extent does this really turn votes? Because if you don't care enough about the homeland to vote for the president, right, who really, they're doing foreign policy. They don't really have that much effect on your daily life as a domestic American living in Pennsylvania, wherever else. If that's not enough of a motivating factor, I don't know what the conversation was like in the Ukrainian American community. I can tell you as a Jewish American, it was a never ending conversation about Trump's relationship versus Kamala's relationship with Israel versus don't think about anything else. And so there's interesting dynamics there at play as well.
So before we move on to our third topic, I want to bring it back to one a little more narrow focus policy question about Ukraine. And that's the ask, right? We know the Trump sweeteners, which is a great phrase that we all should familiar ourselves with, because that is very much what the Zelensky peace deal that was rolled out before the election was. It was a bundle of Trump sweeteners. We talked about that on the podcast when it rolled out, transparently. So almost to the point of proposing substituting Ukrainian troops in for American troops in Europe. You cannot imagine a Trumpier idea, from a certain mega isolationist foreign policy perspective. Maybe there's merit to it, but it certainly appeals to that crowd more than just about anybody else. There's an interesting point here that to think about what Zelensky really wants if he's going to give away whatever it is, rare earth minerals. And from the reporting I've read so far, the closest hint we get is when it comes to security guarantees, where there is this very pointed conversation with Zelensky where he said, I can't remember who he was talking to actually when I saw this conversation come, I think it was with the media, where people floated, what about just European security guarantees? Because you seem to have, including major European actors, the big players, Germany, France, UK, you can see a universe where they get on board with security guarantees way before the Trump administration ever does. And he said essentially, security guarantees don't mean anything if America isn't involved. Which is actually a pretty dramatic statement. One that probably a lot of Europeans don't fully appreciate. Although in some ways maybe it gives them useful cover to avoid having to have the harder conversation of, is this something we go alone? And I don't even know if that was intentional or not on Zelensky's part, because you may only be able to get to Europe at a certain point in the end. So what are the big asks? Is that it? Is it an American security guarantee? Of what form or something more than that? I mean, security assistance has always been the main of the conversation. And that's obviously ask number one. That's kind of maintaining status quo. And in all honesty, that's something that long term is going to be less accountable in a way, because it's not a one-time ask, it's an ongoing ask, and you're going to keep getting these sorts of requests. So what is it that Zelensky wants in exchange for this sort of Trumpy bargaining?
Zelensky does want a guarantee of security for Ukraine going forward. And there are broadly 3 ways how we can achieve that. We can get into NATO, as in do some sort of West German, Norwegian whichever one you want scenario, where the territory that's under our control gets into NATO, the territory that's not doesn't, and then you do legal shenanigans of like making it all look like we're not ceding anything, and you have Article 5 protection. So that's one. That's something that we're actively asking for. An alternative to that, given that it seems like that's not happening anytime soon, is some sort of security guarantee from the US. And we don't know, like there hasn't been a draft document or anything like that, but it's obvious that they're suggesting something like Article 5 of like, if we are under attack from Russia, the US commits to send troops to protect us. Something that would be enough to deter Russia from rearming and reinvading, which is a huge risk, and it's something that Russia has done in other wars. So Ukrainians aren't making it up. Like it's a valid risk that can happen. And if that's off the table, then we want our nuclear weapons back, which is also something we've actively talked about, which I know may sound like ludicrous to people. But there is a thing called the Budapest Memorandum, which is this document that Ukraine signed, and we gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world for the American pledge to protect us from basically a Russian invasion, to protect our sovereignty. Clearly, that hasn't worked out. And so Ukraine has this history of, on the one hand, giving up its nuclear weapons and not receiving anything in return in terms of actual protection to its sovereignty. We also have history of Europeans like not doing anything to protect us. When we talk about Ukraine's NATO aspirations, it was Germany and France that have been consistently blocking us from getting into NATO, or, getting just some sort of plan roadmap to get into NATO, because the Russian influence on Europe was very strong, has always been very strong. And so, that's those are the three options that we have. And the Ukrainian government has said that openly. Like, we can't just sign a deal to stop fighting and then keep on going business as usual, because Russia isn't just going to be like, well, okay, we're done now. Russia is going to rearm and return. And we need some sort of plan to make sure that doesn't happen. And so that could be NATO membership, Article 5, something like Article 5 that's not NATO, but, like an American guarantee, just an American Article 5 kind of thing, or nukes, which we, literally have said openly that, that's the alternative. Americans said that the nukes, not happening, naturally. NATO thing also doesn't seem to be happening because, everyone around Trump, in Trump's orbit, Keith Kellogg, they've all talked about, NATO provoking Russia, and Ukrainian NATO membership is off the table, at least until Putin is in power. So that's not happening. And so the only viable option is some sort of guarantee from Europe and from the US. And Zelensky told in an interview with The Guardian, he said in the interview with The Guardian, either today or yesterday, he said that, guarantees without America are not real guarantees. And this phrase from him came literally a day after Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor, said that America isn't going to guarantee Ukraine anything, and it's going to be squarely Europe's responsibility. So there is a very active conflict happening there. I don't know where it's going to go, but I completely understand why Ukraine is wary of European security guarantees, because Europe hasn't been able to guarantee us anything in the past. If anything, it blocked various processes of, us trying to get more secure and protect ourselves from Russia. And even after the full-scale invasion, the vast majority of everything that we get that keeps our defense going is from America. It's not from Europe. I quote this all the time. As my friend once said, it would be nice if Europe was a thing. So that's, that's pretty much Europe's position since the full-scale invasion. So I completely understand why the Ukrainian government is wary of a German or a French guarantee. And we want America's involvement. So it will be interesting to see how all of these discussions go in the next few weeks, considering that there is such a stark difference in how we view this. Another problem is that we need more military aid, because whatever has been pledged by Biden has already been delivered and it's running out. And so there hasn't been any new pledges since Trump took office. Under Biden, we used to have new packages coming out every other week, maybe, at least once a month. and nothing has happened under Trump. And so that's a real worry. And I saw some reporting that Hegseth is going to come to the Munich Security Conference and then to the Ukraine-related NATO meeting as well. And those are all events at which usually we would see some sort of big pledges, big new agreements on military aid. But the reporting suggested that Hegseth wasn't going to announce anything. So that's worrisome. It's really worrisome because, again, something that a lot of people miss when they talk about the potential peace talks between Ukraine and Russia is that all of those peace talks, whenever they happen and if they even happen, they're all going to be determined, the substance of them is going to be determined by what's happening on the battlefield. If you're in a weak position, you're not going to walk away strong from those peace negotiations. If Russia is winning on the battlefield, which they currently are, they may not even see a reason to stop. And that's a big question as well from the Ukrainian expert community is like, why would Russia stop fighting right now? They're taking village after village because Ukraine doesn't have enough aid and we have our own domestic problems as well with mobilization and such. But like, what is the incentive for Russia to stop? And so that's the key question. It's really not, putting Zelensky to the table, bringing Zelensky to the table. It's not our critical minerals. It's not lithium. It's not anything. It's how do we make Putin come to the table and agree to something that's not a complete Ukrainian defeat or capitulation, which is what all of the previous documents that have been floating around the media, that's what they have been. All of the Istanbul talks, any sort of draft of a peace solution, they've all been extremely unfavorable to Ukraine, and we don't want to repeat that scenario going forward.
Well, we are certainly going to have reason to revisit this in the weeks to come. I think we're going to see a very eventful few weeks on the Ukraine front, just as we are on the Gaza and Middle East front. But as we're getting close to the end of our time, let us not neglect our third topic entirely. Let us go from the rest of the world to bring Question of the World home, but not without an element of the international dynamic here, because of course we are talking about our own city of New York City, the Big Apple, where Mayor Eric Adams has been under federal indictment for the last several months, precisely because of his special manner of engaging with the outside world in accepting certain types of contributions and engaging in other sorts of relationships that raise a number of eyes and eyebrows at the Justice Department under the Biden administration, leading to his indictment that now may be going away. Tyler, I know you've been following the story pretty closely. Talk to us a little bit about what's happened the last few days, reactions to it from folks in New York and in the broader community of folk watching this story. What is going on with Eric Adams and how big of a development is this?
Well, to quote the mayor himself, even Ray Charles can see what's going on, that it is, as you said, a quid pro quo. I mean, it's, Eric Adams for the past several months has been making overtures to President Trump. It was, I think, pretty clear to most people that what he was angling for, which is either, the dropping of charges, a pardon of some kind. But what happened was that the Justice Department sent a memo to SDNY, essentially directing them to drop the charges, these corruption charges against Mayor Adams without prejudice, meaning that I believe that they can bring the charges again later on. And in the memo, which I encourage listeners to read it, it's only 2 pages, they mentioned that the Justice Department has reached this conclusion without assessing the strength of the evidence or the legal theories in which the case is based, rather that they've determined the dismissal is appropriate because of timing and also a diversion of Mayor Adams' attention and resources away from the real problems they say facing in New York City, which is illegal immigration and crime and things like that. But the reaction from across the board in New York is that Eric Adams sold out New York City for one person, and that's Eric Adams. I mean, this is obviously just red meat to Mayor Adams' Democratic primary challengers for the upcoming mayoral election. My guess is that Adams, made a calculation that this is, he's also sacrificing his reelection, but he's gonna avoid any criminal charges or further indictments. An important point here is that SDNY still could bring charges again, which has the added benefit, I think, to the Trump administration of being able to maintain political pressure on Adams to keep him in line. And we're already seeing the fruits of this for the Trump administration. So a local news outlet called The City reported that on Monday of this week, so on February 10th, there was a big meeting between Eric Adams and top deputies in City Hall that he has told people not to criticize Trump publicly. There are also questions of, that he's encouraging city officials to cooperate with ICE agents on immigration matters. So I think quid pro quo was a pretty apt title, although everyone saw this coming. I think it's less of a woe as a quid pro eye roll. I don't know how to say it. But
where were you when I was coming up with titles, Tyler? I mean, what I would say that's amazing about this, because there's this letter that leaked, and this is not something we usually get made public, but a memo from Emil Bove, who's Trump's former personal counsel in the New York trial, I think other trials as well, but particularly the New York criminal trial, now acting deputy attorney general, kind of directing the Southern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney's Office there, that's under acting leadership, to walk back this prosecution. And it's worth noting, that's actually itself a pretty big betrayal of conventional norms. SDNY has traditionally operated pretty independently, even in the first Trump administration. But it does kind of an interesting nod to that in a way that, I wonder really what they're trying to accomplish with this. Although, I can come with some guesses. What they specifically say is that the U.S. Attorney's Office can revisit this case once they have a confirmed nominee. So not the current acting, but confirmed, which right now they don't think they even have anybody nominated. And it says, but it will only do so following the November 2025 mayoral election, which if I were Eric Adams would make me very nervous, because after that mayoral election, he may not be that useful to the Trump administration anymore if he's not mayor and he loses. And then the question becomes, well, if they're not pursuing this prosecution because he needs time to focus on the election and to help aid immigration enforcement and fight crime, which is what this letter says, which is extraordinary in and of itself, would those bases still stand if SDNY looked at this as no, yeah, we actually agree with our prior conclusion. This guy broke the law and we should bring prosecution. So I'm not sure there's a 0% chance that this prosecution doesn't come back. It's crazy. If I were Eric Adams, I'd be kind of nervous about taking this deal, except it's not even a deal. It's just something that's happening for him. And so I'm not sure really what to make of it.
Dan Richman, who's a friend of Lawfare, was quoted in the New York Times. And he's essentially saying that I think the Trump administration could be sending a message beyond Mayor Adams. So I'll just read quickly the sentence. Dan Richman said, it sends its own message about this administration's weaponization of the criminal process. Any official actually prosecuted for corruption has simply not groveled sufficiently to Trump. So, he was pointing out other of Adams' allies who the Justice Department did not direct SDNY to drop charges against them. So I think it's also maybe there's an intended chilling effect beyond Adams himself.
I actually just want to jump in as a Chicagoan, as an Illinoisan, okay? Because there are two pieces of this story that are just fascinating, looking from a different major American city that the Trump administration has.
The Blagojevich of it all is what you're talking about?
They're oh, this is child's play.
Right? Blagojevich, infamously one of the most corrupt politicians in, this is our first governor of the, 4 of the 5 previous governors have ended up in jail, right? It's a tradition like none other. And so Blagojevich getting his pardon, JB and the state issuing laws saying that if you've received a pardon from the federal government doesn't mean you can run for re-election. So I expect massive legal challenges. Does Blagojevich want to be the next mayor of Chicago? All of these sort of interesting questions. If he's going to be the ambassador to Serbia, the pardoning of very publicly seen corrupt officials. He's not a darling of the Illinois Republican Party here, right? This isn't so there's a real, if he hadn't have been on Celebrity Apprentice, would this have happened? No one knows, right? I don't mean that flippantly, but it's weird. And it lands really strangely here in Illinois, where Republicans make a very big deal about, Madigan and the corrupt Democrats, and then Blagojevich has suddenly been pardoned, and it's very odd, right? That's one. The second, for me, which outside of the individual, Punch and Judy show of what's happening, the concept of how sanctuary cities are being, weaponized, he's out. So Chicago is another sanctuary city, and our mayor, who is a deeply, deeply unpopular figure for various different reasons, is seeing this performance that he's going to give in Congress on March 5th in front of the Government Oversight Committee, as his way of trying to restore his credibility. And I'm sure that he will go thermonuclear at that committee And what does that mean for Illinois and what does that mean for Chicago? Yes, I'm sure that there will be law cases about can you discriminate, can you not? But Chicago is not in great shape fiscally. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. We're on the verge of another teacher's strike, which I think as a CPS parent, the city's parent body will go ballistic if a Chicago teacher union mayor can't figure out how to get the Chicago Teachers Union not to strike under his watch. And so the Punch and Judy show of people using Trump either as an ally or an enemy to push up their domestic agenda, whereas people just want the city to function, and all the other bits of this and how that affects a sanctuary city. And, I think there is support that if there are violent criminals that you can remove from the city, you should probably do that. And at the exact same time, no, we don't want ICE going to elementary schools and freaking out children. There is a median here that is like the normal rational person, seeing as a more rational security can see. If someone who is illegally in this country has shot someone, please deport them. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. And our police should be able to do that. And I'm pretty sure, at least in the New York one, it says violent criminals can be done. And I'm hoping that the Illinois or the Chicago statute says something similar, that if you're a violent criminal, and you can be deported, let ICE deport you. At the exact same time, we don't want, enforcement agencies going to schools, right? Or going around neighborhoods and, rounding up grandmothers and everything else. So there is a happy medium that I think most people in this country can agree with. And yet, when it comes to Mayor Adams, or when it's going to come to Mayor Johnson, which is our fun and games, I think we're going to see again all of the actual needs of the community pushed aside for just a political death match where people take smacks out of each other. And how we square all of that is actually very confusing and difficult, as just people who are trying to operate their lives and move through it and stand up for their neighbors who are terrified about whether they can go to school or will their schoolmates be deported and all these other sort of difficult, hard questions, versus mayors trying to get their jollies off by attacking presidents or not. Right.
If the Trump administration's track record on immigration since January 20th was any different, I agree that there's a happy medium, but I just don't see ICE's record in terms of juicing the numbers, in terms of diverting resources, away from, and this is not what you're saying, but diverting resources away from actually finding violent offenders and violent criminals, just hasn't materialized. So I think it's just clearly a political stunt, and it's part of I think the Trump administration would like us to be having this conversation of we should be deporting violent criminals, but that's just not what they're doing. And so
I also think there is an element of overreach here that's worth bearing in mind. Because this letter is just so express and absurd on its face. It says expressly, we are dismissing this indictment without any consideration about and any judgment on the determination that he violated the law. They said, we're not second guessing any of that. We think he did. We're doing it strictly for policy reasons so that he can run for the race, for the mayor's race, because we think there was a little bit of political machination by the prior U.S. attorney. That's the only thing that would be a more conventional factor that might enter into some of this, but it's pretty lightly developed. And because he needs to focus on violent crime and immigration. By the way, they throw in a slam on the Biden administration thing. It's a product of the prior administration's policies. And they mentioned Victor Boat in a footnote, who was traded away from Brittany Grenier a decade after being convicted, as part of a hostage exchange with Russia. All which is to say, if you're that expressed about what you're doing, that you're just using prosecution, targeting it specifically for these policy reasons that are completely independent of people's guilt and innocence, I'm not sure you don't see judicial pushback or institutional pushback, particularly from maybe grand juries that begin to look at this.
Scott, I actually just want to not push back, but just sort of a note of caution to something Tyler said and something you just said, Scott. It's very easy, I do this all the time in my world and everything else, that we lose the wood from the trees. And I think one of the truly unique things that President Trump does very well is that he just cuts through to the very point. Tyler, I don't hear Democrats pushing back saying, well, ICE is moving money away from violent criminals to do these other things. They're just we don't want ICE. Right? That's sort of the message that sort of resonates. Even if that's not true, that's the message that sort of cuts through. And Scott, also to your point, of course, this is an absurd way to use the criminal justice system. I mean, objectively, it's bananas. And yet, by putting that he wants him to focus on violent criminals, whether the statistics bear out or not, the public conversation about crime or the stuff, he's managed to take the megaphone in so many ways. And there might be institutional pushback, but as long as that's not political pushback or in any way public societal pushback, I think what happens is that people think there's a win, but actually there's a loss. And I go back and really think about going back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I look at the trajectory that's happened in Israel, and you can also look in other countries where populist, sometimes authoritarian, sometimes fully authoritarian sort of take over. There's this feeling like we're going to put the institution in between the populism and the implementation of populist policy. And we think that's going to lead to a win. And what that actually does is it just decimates the institution as a elite driven function. It's something that Trump's very good at. I think that as these conversations move forward, and it's very easy when it's like, oh, he's pardoning a corrupt politician, blah, blah, blah. You can clearly see it. But I think what we're seeing again and again is this desire that because there's no actual populist pushback and we're relying on elite institutions to do it, that what happens is that it seems like it's the institutions against the will of the people. And I don't know when Democrats are going to pull themselves off the floor and start actually doing something effective. But my worry is if it's always just, you've got to read the footnotes. No one's reading the footnotes. And I really worry about that as a long-term strategy. We are 3 weeks in, okay? 3 weeks in. And like, it feels like the world's on fire and no one's talking back. And finding that ability, whether it comes to sanctuary cities or corrupt politicians, like, why isn't the talking point? He keeps pardoning corrupt politicians. Like, why isn't it that's the thing? But instead, it sort of gets moved around. So I just worry very deeply about a lot of the elite national security conversations come about institutional preservation. And realistically, I worry that will actually ultimately undermine them in the long run. And I worry about that on a daily basis. And I think about in my own stuff about how you actually have that conversation.
Yeah, just one small pushback to your pushback. Sure. The other message of the Democrats that I'm hearing also is that we ice way harder. You know, like the Biden administration deported record numbers of violent criminals. We're actually the ones that are hard on immigration. So I think also one of the problems of the Democrats though is to your point and my point is it's just convoluted.
I don't even know.
And it's self-contradictory, self-defeating.
Like if we can't figure it out and we kind of watch it pretty quick, closely, I don't know how non-pretty close people are supposed to figure it out.
I buy this to a certain extent, but I also think 3 weeks in is not the political cycle on which pushback happens or narratives are built. And it's a little premature to determine, like Democrats need to figure out a strategy and people oppose us, Republicans as well who oppose these things need to figure out a strategy. You are beginning to maybe see people begin to do it. And then they need to have media and attention opportunities. And like, those are things that don't grow on trees that they have to find opportunities to generate.
It feels like he's been president since election day. And there's lots of reasons for that, okay, in terms of how the transition period was handled and everything else. And if it's only 3 weeks in that you're only now thinking about what a rapid response unit would look like from House Democrats or something else, I say this as not an analyst of Israel-Palestine or a practitioner in foreign policy, but just like a random American who lives in a large city in Illinois. And it doesn't feel like he's been president for 3 weeks. It feels like he's been president for quite a long time. And you're right, 3 weeks in from election day, you can expect that. But 3 weeks in from inauguration day, one might expect that you kind of figured out what he was going to do and maybe there could be some pushback. And I just worry that on all of it, we just say institutions. And I understand why. And I understand that's a good place. But if we look in other places where the institutions corroded to the point of failure, it's because people said institutions. And that's their aim. That's the trap. That's what they want. And I just worry on a long-term provision that this is a diminishing return on investment. And that terrifies me as someone who likes our institutions in America, though do believe that they haven't been delivering the American promise in the same way that I think a lot of people wanted to.
Your institutions only do your work for you if you actually use them. That's my point on that. So if you are going to ignore and say the political narrative is all that matters, which is a strong trend that people are looking for leadership, you're missing, I think that is missing the forest through the trees. Now, institutions can't stand on their own. I totally agree. Like you need to have political narrative. You need to win elections. You need to do a million other things. But institutions are where these battles are going to be fought for the next 18 months. Until the election cycle catches up. And so you have to emphasize and think about these things. And look, when people are thinking about where do I put money? Where do I do different resources? Where do I put the emphasis? I think it's the people fighting it through the institutions that is where they're going to have the impact right now. You can give all the money you want to some ephemeral political campaign, but we just don't know what the terrain is right now. So I don't know. I think you got to accept institutions and politics are in conversation with each other. One can't stand without the other. But discounting, I think you've got to see the institutional fight as being a big part of the calculus here. And particularly at this particular moment, the most important one, not least because it's how you slow things and force things to draw out the contrast with the law that is going to be part of the political response.
I think my main point on this, and I don't disagree with you at all, Scott, like genuinely, like I am like the least, I'm like constantly like working systems and stuff. I think my main point is this. There is a cost to doing it that way. I think that's my main point. And we should be conscious of that cost, of the reputational damage it does to institutions. And genuinely, I don't know the answer of how you mitigate that cost, but I hope some smart people are thinking about how we mitigate that cost, because if we don't, we can see in other countries what's happened. And I don't think we should be assuming that we're immune from that potential downside. So I don't disagree. I think institutions, of course, where the fight back is right now, and to slow it down and all the other things. And you can't just be like, we're fighting for the midterms or we're fighting for this special election and everything else. Fully agree. But how do we mitigate the costs? Because they are targeting things that are supposed to be beyond politics and have made them essentially political. And by doing that, you tarnish them. And so how do we, it's not like our culture where it can shift and change and do other things. Once our institutions are tarnished and diminished, which is part of their goal, by throwing them into the middle of the fight, they're achieving their goal. So I don't know the answer to the jiu-jitsu move, but we're going to have to try and figure it out collectively, because I don't know what happens if we don't.
Well, we could talk about this for a long time, but we are past our time here on Rational Security. So we'll have to end our conversation there. This, of course, would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come. Tyler and Nastya, I have a feeling I know what one of your object lessons, if not both of your object lesson, might be. Does either of you want to take the lead on an exciting development we have coming from the Lawfare circles in the next few weeks?
We can do it together. Can we have a shared object lesson?
I think that's allowed if you're all up for it. Although if you want to have an independent one, I'll let that happen too.
Nastya, take it away.
Okay, so for almost a year, Tyler and I and our colleague Max Johnson from Goat Rodeo, we have all been working very hard on creating a narrative podcast about the relationship between Ukraine and the US, the history of the relationship from the 90s to the present day. A lot of stuff to cover. And the trailer was just released yesterday. The show is called Escalation, the favorite word for Ukrainians. And the actual show will start to be released on February 24th, which is the third-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So look out for that. It's super exciting. The trailer is sick. I highly encourage everyone to listen. And the show is amazing, if I may say so myself. I'm very proud of us. It's a lot of work. And yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just say, you can check out the trailer on Lawfare's YouTube channel. There's a cool visualizer as well with it. And the feed will be the Lawfare Presents podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts. So keep an eye out. And we'll be, Nastya and I are going to go on something of a road show. So keep an eye out for events and panels and other things like that.
Yep.
So we're super excited. It's a lot of work, a lot in the making, and it's almost here.
I've gotten to listen to sneak peeks of a few of the episodes. It is really a phenomenal product. Great work. If you guys, the listeners, have not listened to some of our prior podcasts to toot our horn, which Nastya wasn't involved in, but this project has benefited immensely from her. We've done a lot of these podcasts in the past. They're some of our favorite products we produce here. Absolutely phenomenal stuff. And this one is a step above even our prior work. So if you liked Allies, if you liked The Report, if you liked our other long form podcasts, do not miss Escalation coming in the next few weeks. And we'll have more information on that here on the podcast feed and on other places at lawfaremedia.org in the weeks to come. Stay tuned, including a live launch event in DC that I think folks may be able to attend.
It's going to be at 10 a.m., 10 in the morning on February 24th, the Monday, at Brookings Institution in DC. And we'll have more events in DC and in New York and potentially other places as well.
Awesome. So keep an eye out on lawfaremedia.org and our social media for more information on those events. For my object lesson this week, I will take it to a little more personal place. I read something that I thought was very touching, which is a nice relief to find something, and very interesting, I should say, these days when you're so obsessed with things happening in the news that are generally pretty awful. This was a really actually touching, interesting story about family dynamics and how they have can affect the real changes in the world and changes in people's perception of the worldview. It's called How My Dad Reconciled His God and His Gay Son by Timothy White. It's one of the New York Times really phenomenal kind of mixed social media piece, at least one presented online. I think it's in print as well. Really, really interesting piece, where the author's father, who is a pastor, and it was kind of a committed journaler, I should say. And so kept journals about his experience reconciling his religious views with his son's sexuality over the course of several years. And it's really a touching portrait. I think even if you're, not somebody who is LGBT or has LGBT people in your family, it's like a really touching portrait for also parenthood and the significance of family relationships. And really, really just phenomenal portrait, and really insightful and really touching on a million different levels. And I thought was really, really something, I got a lot of reading. So I encourage people to check that out. Joel, as our newest, attendee here at Rational Security, you get to bring us home. What do you have for us this week?
I'll go back to our earlier conversation about the Super Bowl and say, Jalen Hurts is a fascinating guy, but something he said that stuck with me when he said it a few years ago, was that he said that I had a purpose before everyone had an opinion. And I think that as we work on these Sisyphean tasks, whether it's Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Arab peace or Ukrainian-Russia work or how do we defend our institutions, I think it's important to remember that before everyone has opinions on what we're doing, we had a purpose first, and that our purpose can't be dependent on other people's opinions. And I think that Jalen Hurts proving the doubters wrong about what he managed to do this week in New Orleans in the Superdome in a remarkable way should be an inspiration for all of us who have passion and purpose before other people had opinions.
And that's not even counting Kendrick's, spiking the ball, over Drake. So, it's victories all around for unexpected, combatants at this year's Super Bowl. Well, with that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Remember, Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare, so be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series, including Escalation and coming soon to a podcatcher near you. While you're at it, be sure to follow Lawfare on social media, wherever you socialize your media. Be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening, and be sure to sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan, and we were once again edited by the wonderful Jen Pacha. On behalf of my guests Tyler, Nastya, and Joel, I am Scott R. Anderson. We will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.